Hey everyone! So the video recording didn't work for the last class session, so I've written up a little script that I'm going to more or less go over what we talked about, at least in outline, during the class session. I'm sorry about that technical problem. Don't know exactly why things didn't work, but hopefully they'll work better in the future. And again, remember, you can always come to office hours if you want to go over any of this material or make an appointment with me to go over any of it with me that way as well. So I thought I'd give everyone a little bit of a roadmap of where we're sort of going, what we're going to be doing with all this sort of historical analysis that we've been doing the past couple weeks. Our goal is to get to the point where we can begin seriously investigating and seriously considering what Taylor is calling the transcendent, and maybe more normally we might call God. Right? And my sense is that we actually have a bit of a hard time with this concept now. And part of the reason for that is because we don't sort of recognize the ways in which some things that we think of as just being the way people think about the world, seeing those as sort of like historical creations rather than things that people have always believed. And so I think we need to do is almost sort of work backwards a little bit. We need to reconstruct kind of a sense of what people mean and have meant historically by the idea of the transcendent or transcendence, by sort of understanding its opposite, understanding this thing that Taylor is calling the sort of secular humanism or exclusive humanism. We need to understand sort of like what is that excluding, what is that denying, and then that'll be the transcendent. So we need to sort of trace out this historical development. The trajectory we're going to take is that this week we're basically going to kill the medieval world off. We're going to talk about two sort of efforts that lead to the death of the medieval world. The first, what Taylor calls reform, which we began talking about a little bit last week. And then also today we'll talk about the idea of sort of civilization or civilizing as a project. And then these two notions are going to give rise to kind of a new way of conceptualizing the self, sort of what we're going to talk about on Thursday, a kind of neo-Stoic conception, a sort of neo-Stoic buffered self. This is going to be sort of the first step toward a kind of exclusive humanism. It's still a Christian humanism, if you want to use that sort of language. But it is going to begin dramatically decreasing the role that there is for God to play in the course of normal human life. Next week, we're going to turn to deism, which is a super influential, religious might not even be the right way to put it, philosophical maybe movement, predominantly amongst elites, that happens near the end of the Enlightenment. Almost all of the American founding fathers are deists of some form or another. And this is going to be sort of a new way of conceptualizing God that sort of better fits with this sort of neo-Stoic buffered self than the sort of medieval conceptions of God did. Then finally, the following week, we'll sort of finish up with Taylor. We're going to move to the modernity, where modernity is going to be a sort of a reaction against neo-Stoicism and this sort of neo-Stoic self and deism as well, along a couple of different axes. And so we'll get the proliferation of different kinds of movements or ways of conceptualizing the world in modernity. And then that'll be where we sort of end up with Taylor. And I think from that point, we'll be in a really good position to then begin turning to people like Nietzsche and whatnot, who are going to sort of really start investigating this idea of transcendence and begin calling into question what we mean by it. All right, so the two movements we're going to talk about today in this video are reform and sort of a civilizing project, or the ideal of civilization, something like that. Both of them are really intimately related. You could almost see them as sort of two sides of one project, or related projects that sort of tend to intertwine and overlap in a lot of different cases. Loosely, we could say reform is more religious and civilization is more political, but they, as Taylor goes into great depth in the text to show, those distinctions themselves are a little bit arbitrary. Frequently, it's the exact same people doing both kinds of reforms, and the justification of one kind of reform frequently is the logic of the other kind too. So there are two sort of movements that are going to go hand in hand. So let's do reform first. Just in broad outlines, so reform has sort of a negative and a positive side. So its negative side is a dissatisfaction with a monastic way of life, and also with the corresponding lower ways of sort of being Christian that were practiced by the multitude of people, right? Where sort of your only engagement with Christianity is through things like taking part in these sort of like white magic kind of rituals to do things like protect crops or heal disease. Then the positive side, so negative side, what don't we like? Positive side, what's the goal? The goal is then a kind of a radical reform of society that's intended to raise the standards of practice for the lowest members, while also sort of like abolishing the place for the kind of monastic orders that had previously been the highest expression of Christian practice. Civilization has the two sides, two same sides, sort of a negative and a positive as a sort of ideal. The negative part of the ideal is, again, a kind of dissatisfaction here with the level of citizenship, we could loosely say. Civilization, that word, the civil in it, comes from the Latin word civitas, which basically just means a citizen, or a city, maybe. And that is just in turn a version of the Greek word polis, which is the root of our word for politeness. That again just means the city, or maybe the people within the city, the citizens of the city. So it's a sort of a dissatisfaction with the level of citizenship that people are displaying by the way they're being citizens, in effect. And this is true both for the common people, so people are sort of horrified by the way the common people are acting, but also people being horrified and troubled by the way that the elites are acting too. And so then again, this leads to sort of a positive project, again, the project of radical reform, transformation of society, so that everyone on both the upper and lower classes attain a higher level of sort of citizenship, or being citizens in a better, higher way. The key thing that sort of connects these two movements is this idea of radically transforming the world and the people within it to better live up to an ideal, and not just this as some vague project, but actually something that people really thought could be realized through concrete steps, and indeed people took concrete steps, reformers took concrete steps to bring about. This would have been inconceivable in the Middle Ages and in the ancient world. So there's a couple examples of this. In the Theaetetus, Plato writes, so this is ancient philosophy, Plato writes that the amount of evil in the world is unchanging and can't be either created or destroyed. There's no possibility of eliminating it. That all that sort of we can do as human beings is sort of figure out, are we going to incline toward the evil and so ruin ourselves, or incline toward the good and so elevate ourselves? And that's sort of an individual thing. Societies can be better or worse organized, certainly, but even in the best of societies, there indeed still will be various kinds of things you might think of as evil, or maybe badness, things that fall short of the ideal. Similarly, in St. Augustine, he distinguishes the city of God, which is the sort of those who are sort of the highest level of Christian practitioners, from what he calls the city of man. The city of man in this case is actually a quite literal city. It's Rome, right? The Christianized Roman Empire. It's indeed precisely a Christian nation, but Augustine is convinced that no true beatitude or no true salvation can be found within that city of man. The city of man, by its very nature, is going to be corrupt in various kinds of ways. The best it can do is sort of like create conditions such that the small group of actually elect highest level Christian practitioners, that they can sort of practice, do their thing without being sort of messed with by the sort of mess of society. Right? So the idea that you can sort of radically transform society to make it, in the sort of Puritan language, the city on the hill, right? The city of God, make that into the city of man. This is a radically new project. It is not something that people would have thought of as possible, whereas all of us today think that we should go out and transform the world. It's become a cliche, in fact, that the world can indeed be transformed, and that it's in some sense should be what our goal is, to go out and change things. So let's talk about the reform side first. And by reform, remember we talked about a little bit about this last time, we both mean the Protestant Reformation, so those are examples of people engaged in a reform project, but also figures within the Catholic Church too, maybe like Erasmus, who are also trying to sort of change the way in which Christianity is practiced, both by the elites and by the sort of common person. Let's talk about some of the effects of these various sorts of movements that Taylor describes in the book. So first, maybe most important, is a dramatic increase in sort of disenchantment, right? We talked about how the medieval world was sort of an enchanted one, where sort of meanings kind of imposed themselves upon us, and that the primary function that the church served for the majority of people was as a source of kind of like white magic to protect you from the black magic that was out there in the world. But if our goal is going to be to sort of refocus the lower classes to get them to attain a higher level of spiritual practice, we're going to need to get them off of caring about things like praying to make their crops not die, or praying to make them not be sick, or touching a relic with a goal of attaining wealth or something, right? Like these sort of white magic flourishing in the course of normal life things, we need to reorient them to kind of more spiritual practices and more spiritual goals, right? Elevating their soul rather than protecting themselves from a disease. And so as a result of this, there's a strong push within the church away from this kind of enchantment of the universe to get rid of all the sources of magic. There's only one kind of power in the universe, and that power is God. This goes hand in hand to things that are also happening in natural science that also push away from disenchantment. But one thing that sort of Taylor wants to draw our attention to is that one of the drives for disenchantment, it's the point where we all are today, is indeed a source from within Christianity itself. Christianity itself pushes in that direction. Another big effect of these various reform movements is that there becomes a dramatically increased focus on sort of death and my individual death and the sort of stakes for my soul when I die. What we sort of think of this as part and parcel of what Christianity is, kind of like what's going to happen to your soul when you die. Are you going to go to hell? Can you be saved? Are you going to be stuck in limbo or whatever? Right? That really wasn't the case prior until relatively late in the medieval period, 14th century or so maybe. Maybe roughly around the same time as the Black Death is going on, killing a lot of people. But prior to that, the focus was, and the understanding of death was way closer to how it sort of was conceived in the ancient world, where death was kind of just something that happened. And the thing that needed to be saved wasn't so much me as it was humanity and the human community. At least this is how people sort of tended to think about it. But again, if our goal is to increase the kinds of practice carried out by the lower classes, it will be beneficial if we can basically scare them, right? So you get increasing kind of scary tactics, increased talk of hell, increased sort of transformation of how hell is conceived of as a place of sort of torments and whatnot, as opposed to kind of just the state of being spiritually alienated from God. And also, similar then, this gives rise to the idea of creation of limbo as a kind of intermediate state for those who maybe don't deserve eternal damnation, but also who aren't good enough for heaven, which would be probably most everyone, as a kind of intermediate place where you can sort of work out your kind of salvation after you continue to die. The result of all of this focus, so one thing, the particularly increased focus on limbo and some of the resulting rituals that sort of get demanded by that, like plenary indulgences. This is a big thing that the Protestant reformers hate. They really hate a lot of this talk. So that's one thing that happens. But for our purpose, a more interesting thing that sort of happens during this, as a result of this kind of movement, is that there's a pronounced shift from a demand for more personalized stakes for religious life. If what's at stake is my eternal soul, and that's what's scaring me, I'm going to demand forms of worship and forms of practice that are similarly individuated, that similarly point to me rather than point to the community that I'm a part of. And so we see a dramatic increase at all levels of practice of things like prayer practice, devotional practices where, for example, that maybe you're focusing on the suffering of Christ on the cross and understanding the suffering in your own life in those terms. Things like faith practices, again, maybe especially in certain Protestant circles, because the thing that's at stake in religion isn't the community anymore. It's now me personally, my individual soul. The kinds of practices that emerge are similar, going to have to be individually, personally oriented to some extent. All right, so we've been talking about sort of the lower class effects. Let's now talk about the other side of this, the abolition of the sort of monastic vocations, the higher order vocations. This is especially true in Protestantism. Within the Catholic Church, there still is some place for these monastic orders. And in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they never go anywhere. But within the Protestant Church, especially Calvin and Luther, they despise these monastic orders. They kind of start to strike people as perverse. And the reason why this sense of these things as kind of perverse begins to emerge is because the kind of individualized personal practices that are emerging out of these various kinds of reform efforts, they sort of lower what the goal to be attained within life is to some extent. They're all things that you can do in the course of living a normal life. And what do I mean by normal life? I mean sort of life in terms of sort of secular time rather than life oriented toward any kind of higher times, right? You can have a family, you can be working to make money, you can have a political office, right? None of these things are incompatible with any of these more personalized forms of worship, whereas the whole point of monastic practice is to get away precisely from that secular time and the tasks and activities of secular time to be oriented toward the higher kinds of eternity that are sort of, present within divine things. And so you give up sex, you take a vow of celibacy. You give up money, take a vow of poverty, right? You're giving up the world for the sake of something that's higher than it. But if now we're sort of trying to ground Christian practice within worldly daily affairs, something started to strike a lot of people as kind of perverse or odd about the monastic orders precisely because of the way they were trying to move beyond the world or leave the world behind. The end result of all of this is that it really is true that the sort of floor of practice gets raised, right? The average person probably is way more devout than they previously were, but the ceiling is also getting lowered. We're no longer sort of allowing for the sort of highest expressions, or at least what previous ages would have thought of as the highest expressions of Christian practice. And we're getting ever increasingly removed from the sort of higher times, the higher eternities, the higher vocations, things that are oriented toward transcendence, and getting increasingly oriented toward sort of just the affairs of normal life and being Christians via living normal life in a certain way. All right, now let's start talking about the sort of civilizing efforts and sort of civilizing kind of transformations that are taking place during this time period too. So at root, let's just sort of give the overarching structure of all these kind of movements. Right? The goal of all of these sort of civilizing efforts is to increase the level of discipline or order that's manifested within society at all levels. Ideally, this discipline will be imposed sort of self-discipline, right? I'll be disciplining, controlling myself. But if necessary, say for the lower classes or whatnot, this discipline can also be exposed or imposed externally if that's necessary. The drive for all of this is that a lot of what we think of as sort of like normal, polite society does not exist in the Middle Ages. So if you all, familiar with Romeo and Juliet, right? This is an example of Shakespeare sort of dramatizing some of this. The basic premise of Romeo and Juliet is that you have these two sort of, quote, gangs, the Montesquieux and the Capulets or whatever, right? But these are actually like elites. Like these are the elite leaders of the society. And what are they doing with their time? They're precisely like getting into street fights with one another. And this is not an uncommon thing. This is not actually like some outlandish circumstance or whatever, right? Like this is actually what life was frequently like. It was incredible, a lot of violence, sort of non-state sanctioned violence taking place. Again, both amongst lower classes, but also the upper classes too. The elites are also doing all of this. And so it was thought that there was really needed some kind of like pronounced imposition of order and discipline to get the standards of citizenship up higher. As a result, that's actually frequently why there's sort of a connection and correlation between a lot of these sort of civilizing efforts and this ideal of civilization and sort of like racist and colonial exploitation that sort of follows from it. It's the same time that these civilizing efforts are taking place, that the sort of colonization of North America is taking place, and the enslavement in North Africa is taking place. And the justification is frequently civilization. Indeed, we're civilized, they're not, so therefore we're justified in doing this. It's not an accidental feature. It actually sort of goes hand in hand with the new way of thinking about what society and civilization is that's emerging as a result of this kind of ideal. It now is the case that if a society doesn't look like Western European societies, so these highly disciplined, structured societies, this is now kind of moral failing of those other societies, right? That the people don't have the appropriate level of discipline and self-control. And so, as a result, you can see how you can get from that to the idea of sort of the savages, different from the ideas that previously existed of barbarians. The barbarians are basically just people who did things differently than us. And so that's literally the Greek word barbaros. That's where the word barbarian comes from. It literally, how we say yada 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 in English, it's bar is what the Greeks said. So the barbarians are literally the people who just go bar, the people who don't speak Greek, who we can't understand. And as a result, the Greeks didn't necessarily think all barbarians were worse than them. They thought some were. They thought the Persians were worse than them, but at least many ancient Greeks seemed to think that the Egyptian civilization was actually superior to theirs in some respect. Plato often talks that way. But if you have this idea of civilization, right, the antonym of civilized is savage, right? Someone who does not have control over themselves and their faculties. And since, as we're going to see, this idea of sort of self-discipline, self-control becomes kind of like a highest moral ideal. Not living up to that becomes a kind of moral failing, goes hand in hand with sort of a justification for racist and colonialized exploitation. All right, so let's go a little bit through now some of the different sort of ramifications and effects of these various kinds of civilizing efforts. First, we get a shift from what the elites are focused on. The elites in the Middle Ages were predominantly focused on warfare. There were things like knights and whatnot. Now that focus shifts to an economic one, right? So being a good businessman becomes the primary activity that the elites are engaged within. Now, of course, there's an intimate relationship between economics and warfare, as Taylor points out, right? We're sort of moving to an era where warfare is sort of going to be decided technologically by having the largest ships, the biggest cannons, the most guns, the best guns, right? And as a result of that kind of shift, which had always been true to some extent, but it dramatically increases, what's needed now for military strength is economic strength. And so the economic powers of the region quickly outstrip the earlier military powers. Countries like England, for example, as a result of its economic might, quickly begins to exert a great deal of military might. So there's a connection between the military and the economics, but in shifting what the elites are sort of how they're thinking of themselves, they're thinking of themselves as business people, not warriors. That's a very pronounced and profound shift in how people sort of conceptualize themselves, and it has real ramifications as we start getting to things like the development of capitalist structures and whatnot within society. Another big effect, we start to get increasing levels of sort of politeness standards and sort of like civility standards within societies. Again, the Middle Ages is way ruder than we sort of think of it as being. You read Chaucer or whatever, right? And it's almost, you need like a translation of it because the English is hard to sort of parse for a lot of us. But like if you actually read it through, get a translation of it, it's basically like South Park levels of bawdy. And this was the case throughout the Middle Ages. There's a story that Taylor tells that I think is just hilarious, where at in preparation for the Council of Trent, which is this big council that was supposed to sort of like codify a lot of the sort of orthodox positions of the Catholic Church, the church made sure that there were a lot of brothels available for all the attendants, right? Could be a good host. Make sure everything's available, right? I mean, this strikes us as sort of insane, but a lot of what we think of as sort of like these sort of like moral standards or standards of intimacy did not really exist during the Middle Ages. Certainly, at least, they weren't followed by a lot of people, and again, not just low-class people, high-class people as well. And so as a result, you start to get various kinds of politeness and intimacy restrictions put on people to get closer to sort of like the separate, like, almost just like embarrassment of like being kind of disordered, being kind of bodily in a lot of cases. And other things that get transformed during this, as a result of these various kinds of transformational efforts, you get a very different understanding of things like poverty and mental illness. In the Middle Ages, the poor were kind of a social class, actually. And like by poor, I don't just mean like low-class workers. I mean like farmers say. I mean like beggars. They were almost like a social role within the society. It's weird to say because we think of classes as things that in some sense contribute to economic prosperity, and obviously a beggar is not doing that. But what the beggar is contributing to in the society is it's giving people the opportunity to express Christian virtues of charity, right? And so, having beggars in the community is in some sense a good thing. It gives those with money and power the sort of chance to be good Christians, right? To engage in charitable giving. Similarly, the idea of sort of the holy idiot or the sacred idiot, right? Some people who we would now say were suffering from some kind of mental illness, at the time would just be like people who would wander around the town. They would be sort of part of the community, again, kind of like as a social role. Again, a chance to practice Christian charity. This gets radically transformed, but such people are obviously not part of the disciplined, ordered society that these reformers are trying to bring about. And so poverty goes from being a necessary structure of human life, and again, by poverty I mean things like beggars and whatnot, like abject poverty. And it goes from that to kind of like a blight on society, something that needs to be eliminated, and again, something that's sort of the fault of the poor because they aren't working hard enough, they're not disciplined enough, And so what you actually see is the abolition of begging in a lot of places. You start to get a great deal of things like prisons, poorhouses, asylums start to get invented, where basically we're going to sort of shut out people who we can't discipline in the appropriate ways. We're going to sort of shut them out of society in ways that are frequently quite shocking to us. If any of you know the Christmas Carol, when Scrooge is, like when someone's trying to get charity from him, and he says, "Why are there no prisons, no poorhouses?" These were basically like institutions that were created so that the poor would be basically locked away from the rest of society until they could reform themselves, until they could prove themselves disciplined enough. There's a radical transformation in how these things are being thought of. Another huge transformation that we see is within ethics. So the goal in ancient ethics is really harmony of the soul. That's how it sort of gets described by almost everyone. The Platonists, the Aristotelians, the Neo-Stoics, or not the Stoics, just the old-fashioned Stoics. Even the Epicureans talk that way, even though it's a little bit hard to figure out how it fits with their system in some respects. And in fact, the extent to which harmony is the goal, it's to such an extent that Aristotle actually doesn't think self-control is a virtue. He thinks it's actually a bad thing. This is sort of shocking to us now, the idea that self-control can be a bad thing. But for the Aristotelian view, if you need to be in control of yourself, you're not in a harmonious relationship. The virtuous person in Aristotle is the person who wants what they should want, thinks that what they want is what they should want, and is right about all of this, right? So their mind is getting what's right about human behavior. Their desires correspond to what their mind is saying is right. And so there's no place for self-control. There's nothing that needs to be controlled. All the various faculties and parts of the soul are in agreement with one another. This gets radically transformed, we'll talk about this more on Thursday, but into sort of this ethos of self-control, where self-control becomes the highest virtue. And the idea of harmony almost becomes inconceivable. Where you end up getting this sort of dictatorship of disinterested reason, right? There's one part of me, this sort of disinterested rationality, that now needs to rule over the rest of the body as a dictator, right? As something that the rest of the body, the rest of myself can't be brought into line. It must be now controlled, partially violently sounding. And this has huge ramifications in this ethical level. We'll talk about this a lot more on Thursday when we get into the Neo-Stoic teachings. And sort of see how this leads to a really different way of conceptualizing what it is that we actually are. And then last thing that gets really radically transformed as a result of all of this is the conception of the state. We get the emergence of literally the police state. In French, not have me try to pronounce French. The police state, right? And it literally in French, the literal translation would be polite society, right? Because again, police comes from this Greek word polis, again, politeness, being a good citizen. And what we mean by the police state is it's the state that's capable of imposing discipline and order on every aspect of human life, right? And so where we see this manifested in all kinds of different ways, in maybe say some certain Puritan circles can be a good case to see how some of this is in action. You start getting sort of like really pronounced laws imposing sort of moral behavior in all kinds of arenas that previously laws wouldn't have existed within. This is where sexual morality, sexual laws, sexual customs really start to take off as a thing that is sort of like a major focus of the state. Whereas before it just wasn't. Even lust wasn't even one of the biggest sins that people were concerned with in the Middle Ages. People were way more concerned with greed and sort of violent anger. So that's one example of this where you're seeing the state now sort of like policing, right? The police state, right? And imposing discipline in a variety of new settings. Another place to use is education. Education was always thought to be a private matter, but now educative discipline is going to be sort of imposed as a function of the state. The reason why modern education exists is to make you all disciplined. Why are there bells and stuff? Why do you have to be a certain place at a certain time? It was to turn a whole bunch of farmers into good soldiers and a whole bunch of good factory workers, right? To impose discipline upon them. This is the state now regulating a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of, again, sort of like almost just intimate parts of life with an eye toward disciplining them, and the state having the power and indeed the duty and obligation to do this as a new activity. Radically new transformation. All of this is going to give rise to a very different sense of what it is that a human being is, and it's going to push us further and further away from sort of like orienting our lives towards anything transcendent and ordering our lives toward things that are sort of like the imminent day-to-day activities of life. All right, so that should do it for this video. Hopefully the Thursday video will work and I don't have to do this again. So yeah, I'll talk to you all Thursday. Bye.